The moment Dexter Shelby carried the boy through the front door of the ranch house, something inside him broke open in a way he had not felt since the night he buried his wife 3 years ago on the hillside behind the barn. The child was limp with exhaustion, his small dark head pressed against Dexter's broad shoulder, one tiny fist curled around the fabric of Dexter's flannel shirt, as though even in sleep he refused to let go of the one solid thing he had found. Abigail Fletcher stood behind him in the doorway, her dress torn at the hem, mud caked to her boots, her eyes red from crying, though she had not made a single sound in the last mile of their desperate walk through the dark. She was watching Dexter's face, and she saw something there that frightened her more than the men who had burned her wagon, more than the cold, more than the hunger. She saw tenderness. And Abigail Fletcher had sworn to herself after the last man who'd looked at her like that had gotten himself killed and left her with a 4-year-old son and a secret that could destroy everything, that she would never again let tenderness be her undoing. Dexter crossed to the back bedroom without a word, the floorboards barely creaking under his careful boots. He laid the boy down on the narrow bed as gently as if the child were made of spun glass, and he reached down and pulled the worn wool blanket up over those small shoulders without waking either of them from whatever private dream they were sharing. Then he stood there in the dark for a long moment, his hand still resting on the edge of the blanket, and he did not move. Abigail stood in the doorway of that little room and watched the solitary man with the rigid jaw and the guarded eyes stand there in the quiet dark and hold himself completely still, and she felt something shift in her chest that had no name and no safe place to go. She had not expected any of this. She had not expected him at all. 3 days before that night, Abigail Fletcher had been sitting in a stagecoach traveling west through the Colorado Territory in the autumn of 1878, a carpet bag on her lap and her son Benjamin asleep across the seat beside her with his head on her thigh. She had $43 hidden in the lining of her boot, and a letter folded in her coat pocket from a man named Harlan Drood, who ran the General Mercantile in the town of Caldwell Creek. The letter promised her work as a seamstress and a room above the store. She had taken the promise at face value because she had no other choice. She had spent the last 8 months in Denver after fleeing her previous life with nothing more than Benjamin and whatever courage she could scrape together. And Denver had been expensive and unkind and full of men who knew her late husband's name for all the wrong reasons. Thomas Fletcher had not been a bad man exactly. He had been a weak one, which in the end amounted to the same thing. He had borrowed money from the wrong people, men who operated in the shadows between the law and the lawless, and when he had died of a fever in the spring of 1877, he had left Abigail not just a widow but a liability. The men he owed had come to collect, and what they wanted was information, not money. They wanted to know what Thomas had told her, what documents he might have kept, whether the ledger that recorded their transactions had survived. It had not, because Abigail had burned it herself the night before the funeral. She had not told anyone that. She kept that secret folded inside her like a hidden blade because it was the only protection she had. She had fled with Benjamin when the threats turned specific. She had moved twice, changed her story, told no one the full truth of it. By the time she boarded the stagecoach to Caldwell Creek, she had convinced herself the trail was cold and the danger had passed. She was wrong about that, but she did not know it yet. The stagecoach carried 4 passengers, including herself and Benjamin. The other 2 were a cattle broker named Prentice, who wore his watch chain like a trophy, and a thin, quiet woman named Mrs. Oakes, who was going to visit her daughter. On the morning of the 3rd day, somewhere in the high country between the last relay station and Caldwell Creek, the driver brought the horses to a sudden jolting stop, and before anyone could ask what was happening, the door was wrenched open, and a man with a bandana over his face climbed halfway inside and told everyone to sit still and not make a sound. There were 3 of them. They were rough men, organized in the careless way of men who had done this before and not been caught. They took Prentice's watch chain and Mrs. Oak's brooch without much ceremony. Then the one with the bandana looked at Abigail for a long time, long enough that the hairs on her arm stood up and her hand tightened on Benjamin's shoulder. He did not take her money. He said very quietly that she should step outside with him. She said no. He said it was not a question. Benjamin woke up. He looked at the man, and he looked at his mother's face, and he did not cry, because he was 4 years old and he had already learned that crying made things worse. He just pressed himself against Abigail's side and stared with those serious dark eyes that had always looked too old for his face. What happened next was a confusion of motion. Abigail threw the carpet bag at the man's face. It was not heroic. It was just the only thing within reach. The distraction was enough for the driver, who had climbed down from the box, to try to make a move of his own, and in the chaos of shouting and horses stamping and Mrs. Oakes screaming, Abigail grabbed Benjamin and jumped from the coach on the opposite side and ran for the tree line. She made it into the trees. She could hear them behind her for a while, and then she could not. She ran until Benjamin became too heavy to carry, and then she walked, holding his hand, moving downhill because someone had once told her that water runs downhill and people need water, and water usually meant settlements. She did not know where she was. She had lost her bag. She had her coat, her boots, her son, and the $43. She walked for the rest of that day and all of the following night. By the time the sun came up again, Benjamin could not walk anymore. He was not sick, just exhausted in the absolute way of young children, and she carried him on her back and kept moving and tried not to think about what would happen if she did not find help soon. She found the fence line first, a long, well-maintained run of cedar posts and good wire stretching away across the hillside. She followed it for an hour and came over a rise and saw below her the buildings of a working ranch, smoke rising from the chimney of the main house, a barn big enough to house 40 head, and a man in a brown coat splitting firewood in the yard. She stood on the rise for a moment looking down at it. Every instinct built up by the last year and a half of running told her to be careful. Told her that the wrong person's help could be worse than no help at all. But Benjamin was asleep against her shoulder, and her legs were shaking, and she had not eaten in more than a day. And so she started down the hill. The man with the axe heard her coming when she was still 50 yards out. He put down the axe and turned and looked at her without moving, the way a man does when he has lived alone long enough that an unexpected arrival is something to be assessed before it is welcomed. He was tall, lean in the way of men who work hard and eat simply. His face was angular, weathered by the kind of outdoor life that ages a man honestly. He had dark eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same timber as his fence posts. He looked at her. Looked at the boy on her shoulder. He said nothing. She said, "I need help." He said, "I can see that." His voice was low and even. It had the quality of a man who had trained himself not to give much away. He told her his name, Dexter Shelby. He told her this was the Shelby Ranch, 47 sections of mixed grass and timber in Garfield County, Colorado Territory. He said it the way a man says his name when he is reminding himself of what he is, not performing it for a stranger. Then he picked up his axe, set it against the woodpile, and said, "Come inside." That was how it began. With a man who asked no questions, and a woman who was full of secrets, and a sleeping child who was the only innocent thing in the arrangement. Inside the house, Abigail sat at the kitchen table and ate cornbread and salt pork and drank coffee so strong it made her jaw tighten, and she answered Dexter Shelby's questions in the careful, edited way she had practiced. She said she was a widow traveling to Caldwell Creek for work. She said the stagecoach had been robbed. She said she had gotten separated and lost. She did not say anything about Thomas's debts, or the ledger she had burned, or the men who had been watching her in Denver. She said her son's name was Benjamin, and he was 4 years old. Dexter listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "Caldwell Creek is 12 miles northeast of here. The trail goes through Packers Canyon. It would be a hard walk in good conditions." He looked at Benjamin, who was eating cornbread with both hands and looking around the kitchen with the alert, adaptable curiosity of a child who has learned to make himself comfortable wherever he ends up. Then Dexter said, "You can stay until you're rested and I can take you in the wagon." She started to say something about not wanting to be a burden, and he stopped her with a small, flat gesture of his hand that said the thing was already decided and the protest was unnecessary. So she did not protest. She was too tired to perform courtesy she did not feel. He gave her and Benjamin the back bedroom. It was small and plain, with a single window looking out over the hillside, a iron frame bed, and a nightstand with a tin lamp. It smelled of cedar shavings and old wool. It was the cleanest room Abigail had slept in since leaving Denver. She fell asleep with Benjamin curled against her and did not dream. She woke in the early morning to the sound of Dexter outside starting the day. She lay there listening to the familiar sounds of a working ranch waking up, the low sound of cattle, the rhythmic scrape of boots on frozen ground, and she was struck by a feeling so unfamiliar she almost did not recognize it. Safety. She pulled it back from herself quickly, like a hand from a hot stove, because safety had been the thing she had felt with Thomas in the beginning too, and she knew now what promises of safety were worth. She got up and dressed, and came out to find that he had already started breakfast. He moved around the kitchen in the efficient, unself-conscious way of a man who has been cooking for himself for a long time, and he handed her a cup of coffee without looking up from the skillet. She stood in the kitchen doorway and thought that there was something deeply strange about standing in a strange man's house and having it feel less foreign than anywhere she had been in 2 years. "How long have you been out here alone?" she asked. He turned the bacon in the pan before he answered. 3 years. She did not ask what had happened 3 years ago. The shape of it was plain enough in the emptiness of the house, in the way the room held 2 people but was furnished for 1, in the single cup on the shelf where there should have been 2. He said without her asking, "My wife died. Her name was Clara." He said it clean and brief, with the directness of a man who has made peace with a fact but not with the feeling of it. "I'm sorry," Abigail said. "So am I," he said, and that was the end of it. Benjamin woke up to bacon and Dexter Shelby, and he regarded the tall man with his usual serious scrutiny. Children who have been through upheaval develop a sensitivity to danger that adults sometimes mistake for shyness, and Benjamin was not shy. He was cautious. He watched Dexter set a plate in front of him and pour milk from a jug, and then he said with the direct gravity of the very young, "Do you have horses?" Dexter looked at the boy for a moment as though recalibrating something. "I do," he said. "Can I see them?" "After breakfast." That was all it took. Benjamin ate his breakfast at a speed that suggested the horse visit was a competitive deadline, and Dexter watched him with an expression that was difficult to read, because he had trained his face not to be readable. But Abigail saw it anyway. She saw the way he looked at Benjamin when the boy was not looking at him, the quick, unguarded glance that carried something complicated and private, something that looked like longing and was almost immediately covered over. She filled that observation away and told herself it was none of her business. He showed Benjamin the horses after breakfast. There were 14 of them, a mix of working quarter horses and 2 good mares he was running as breeding stock. Benjamin stood at the fence with his hands gripping the rail and his chin, barely clearing the top board, and watched them move with the transfixed attention of a child who has just discovered his particular devotion. Dexter stood beside him, and after a moment he pointed out the bay gelding nearest to them and told Benjamin his name was Cannonball and that he was the fastest horse on the ranch and also the most opinionated. Benjamin said, "What does opinionated mean?" Dexter said, "It means he has a lot of ideas about things." Benjamin considered this. "Like what things?" Dexter said. "Like which direction he wants to go, and whether it's worth doing what you ask him, and whether you deserve his cooperation." Benjamin looked at the horse with renewed respect. "I think I understand him," he said, and Dexter Shelby laughed. It was not a big laugh. It was quiet and surprised, as though it had gotten out before he could stop it. But Abigail heard it from where she was standing back by the barn door, and she felt it land somewhere below her sternum and stay there. She told herself to stop it. She told herself she was not that kind of foolish, not anymore. But the trouble with Dexter Shelby was that he made it very difficult to maintain the particular careful distance she had built around herself, because he did not press. He did not ask her questions beyond the practical. He did not look at her with the speculative assessment she had become accustomed to from men who saw a young widow as an opportunity. He simply moved through his days and made room for her and Benjamin within them, and offered nothing she had not asked for. He was a working rancher in every sense. His days began before light and ended when the light was gone. He ran the ranch with one part-time hand, a young man of 20 named Eli who rode in 3 days a week from his family's farm to the south, and was cheerful and reliable and clearly a little in awe of Dexter's silent competence. The ranch was a serious operation. He ran about 200 head of cattle, rotated his pasture carefully, maintained his equipment without waste. Everything on the property spoke of a man who understood the deep grammar of land and took his obligations to it seriously. On the second evening, while Benjamin slept, Abigail sat at the kitchen table and tried to figure out what she was going to do. The problem was that the reason she had been on that stagecoach in the first place had reattached itself to her thoughts. The man who had reached into the coach and asked her to step outside had not been a random outlaw. She was increasingly certain of that. The way he had looked at her, the specific quality of his attention, the fact that he had not taken her money, all of it pointed towards someone who had been looking for her specifically. Which meant the trail was not as cold as she had hoped, which meant going to Caldwell Creek and working in a mercantile under her own name was not the safe option she had thought it was. She was sitting with this terrible arithmetic when Dexter came in from the last check of the evening and stood at the wash basin and cleaned up and then turned around and looked at her. He said, "You're not going to Caldwell Creek." It was not a question. She said, "I beg your pardon." He said, "I've been watching you think for 2 days. You thought your way out of eating dinner yesterday. You've been sitting here for an hour and you haven't moved. Whatever you're working out, the answer keeps coming back the same way and it's not a good one." He sat down across from her. "You don't have to tell me what it is, but you should know that whatever you're thinking about doing next, you don't have to do it tonight." She looked at him. The lamp between them put warm light on his face and showed her the tiredness around his eyes and the steadiness underneath it. She said, "You don't know what kind of trouble I'm carrying." He said, "No. But I know you're carrying it alone and you've been doing it for a while." A pause. "That's the kind of thing that breaks people eventually," she said. "I don't break easily," he said. "I know, I can see that." Then quietly, "That's not the same as saying you don't break." She looked away first. There was a dangerous truth in that and she did not want him to see her recognize it. She told him some of it that night. Not all of it, not the ledger, not the names, but enough. She told him that Thomas had been involved with men who operated outside the law, that he had died owing them something more than money, and that since his death those men had made it clear they did not consider her separate from the debt. She told him she had been moving to stay ahead of it and that she thought she had succeeded, and now she was not sure. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he sat quietly for a moment and then he said, "The man on the stagecoach. Would you recognize him again?" She said she would. He said, "The man who runs the worst of what moves through this part of the territory is named Colton Briggs. He operates out of a town about 30 miles west called Grantham. He has 4 or 5 men who do his looking for him." He looked at her directly. "If those are the people you're talking about, then you are in real danger, and Caldwell Creek is not far enough." The name Colton Briggs hit her like cold water. It was the name Thomas had whispered in the dark one night 6 months before he died, when he'd had too much whiskey and too much guilt and had told her in fragments more than he should have. She had not told Dexter she knew the name, but the fact that he did, the fact that a rancher in the middle of the Colorado Territory knew exactly who she was talking about before she said the name out loud, told her that this man, this quiet, careful man across the table, was not quite as simple as he appeared. She said, "How do you know that name?" A long pause. He looked at his hands on the table. Then he said, "Briggs tried to buy my water rights 3 years ago. I said no. 3 weeks later my barn burned and my wife was inside it." The silence after that was absolute. Abigail felt the breath leave her body. She said, "Dexter," he said, "the county sheriff ruled it an accident. I knew it wasn't. I couldn't prove anything and I had a ranch to save from collapsing without her." He looked up. "So I stayed quiet, and I've been quiet ever since. And I have spent 3 years waiting for him to make a move I could do something about." She understood then what she had walked into. She had not arrived at a safe harbor. She had arrived at the exact center of the same storm. She was already inside. And yet, looking at Dexter Shelby across the table, she did not feel more afraid. She felt something more complex than that. She felt, for the first time in 2 years, that she was not entirely alone in this. She said, very carefully, "I burned a ledger the night before Thomas was buried. I didn't know what was in it completely, but I knew enough to know it recorded transactions. Names, dates, amounts. I thought burning it was protection. But if they're still coming for me, I wonder if maybe what they want isn't proof that I have it. Maybe what they want is proof that it's gone." Dexter looked at her for a long moment. "Or," he said, "maybe Thomas told them you had seen enough of it to know things that could hurt them even without the document itself." She had not thought of it that way. The cold certainty of it settled over her slowly. She said, "Then running doesn't solve the problem." He said, "No, it doesn't," she said. "So what does?" he said. "That's what I've been trying to figure out for 3 years." They sat in the lamplight for another hour and talked it through. It was not a plan, not yet. It was the beginning of one. It was the first time since Thomas died that Abigail had sat across from another person and been completely honest about the shape of the thing she was up against, and the relief of it was so acute it almost hurt. When she finally stood to go to bed, he said, quietly, "You should know that you're welcome here, as long as you need to be." She said, "You don't know what you're offering." He said, "I think I do." She went to bed and lay next to her sleeping son, and stared at the ceiling and told herself that Dexter Shelby's offer was practical, strategic, nothing more. She told herself she was interpreting kindness as something it was not because she was tired and frightened and lonely. She told herself all of this with great conviction and believed almost none of it. In the following days, something shifted on the ranch. It shifted so slowly and naturally that it was hard to point at the exact moment it changed, but it changed nonetheless. Benjamin attached himself to Dexter with the wholehearted, non-negotiable devotion of a young boy who has been without a father long enough that, when the right kind of man appears, there is simply no resistance to it. Dexter handled this with a care that was almost painful to watch. He was gentle with the boy, but never falsely so, never performing warmth he did not feel. He taught Benjamin how to fill the water trough and let him help carry the grain bucket, and showed him how to put his hand out flat for Cannonball to smell, so the horse could decide whether he was worth trusting. Abigail watched all of this from various distances and tried to maintain the careful emotional accounting she had developed as a survival skill, the one where every feeling was assessed for whether it was useful or dangerous. The trouble was that every time she ran the accounting on Dexter Shelby, the numbers came out in ways she did not know how to categorize. He was not a demonstrative man. He did not say more than was necessary, and he made no overtures, and he maintained a perfectly respectful distance at all times. But there was a quality to his attention that was impossible to mistake, a kind of steady, peripheral awareness of where she was and whether she was all right that reminded her of nothing so much as water finding its level. It was not something he was performing. It was something he could not help. She began to notice that he had started making small modifications to the day. He came in for dinner instead of eating in the barn as he apparently had done in the years since Clara died, as Eli had told her with entirely unconscious candor while she was helping him mend a saddle. He started a second cup of coffee in the morning at a time that corresponded to when she woke up. He repaired the back step, which had been soft for apparently quite a while, the week after she mentioned stepping carefully on it. None of these things were declarations. None of them were anything she could point to as evidence of feeling. They were just the small, accumulated actions of a man who was paying attention, and she found herself paying attention right back, which was the most dangerous thing she could possibly be doing. On the fifth day, Eli came to the ranch with news from town. He was a young man who carried information the way some people carry groceries, with no particular awareness of the weight. He said that there had been men in Caldwell Creek asking about a woman traveling with a small boy, men who had come from the West and were offering money for information. He said the storekeeper in Caldwell Creek, a man named Harlan Drude, had apparently told them he was expecting a woman matching that description. He said people were talking about it. Dexter did not look at Abigail when Eli said this, but she felt the quality of his stillness change. After Eli left, Dexter said, "They know you were headed to Caldwell Creek." She said, "Yes." He said, "They'll be watching for you between here and there." She said, "Yes." He turned and looked at her and said, "Then you stay." She said, "Dexter, I can't simply stay indefinitely on your ranch because it's safer for me. That's not fair to you." He said, "I'm not asking for fair, I'm asking for sensible." She said, "Those men are connected to Colton Briggs. If Briggs finds out I'm here, that's danger for you too, more than you already have." He said, "I'm aware of that." She said, "I won't be the reason this place burns again." The moment she said it, she saw what it cost him, the way his jaw tightened and something moved across his face that was swift and deep and quickly controlled. She said, "I'm sorry, that was a terrible thing to say." He said quietly, "No, it was an honest one," a pause. "But you're thinking about this wrong. You're thinking about it as if your presence here is a burden you're imposing. You're not thinking about it as two people with the same problem." She looked at him. He said, "Briggs burned my barn and killed my wife, and I have never had anything to do anything about it with. You were married to a man who worked for him, and you burned the document that would have proven it, and you know enough, apparently, that they're willing to follow you across a territory to make sure you can't use it. That's not nothing, Abigail." It was the first time he had said her name like that. Not formally, not carefully, just plainly, the way you say the name of someone who has become a real person to you. She felt the full weight of it. She said, "What exactly are you proposing?" He said, "I know a United States Marshal. His name is Garland Price. He works out of Pueblo. He has been building a case against Briggs for 2 years without enough to move on. If what you know is what I think it is, it might be enough to tip that balance." She felt cold. She said, "Going to a marshal means my name gets used. It means a formal account. It means testimony, potentially." He said, "Yes. It also means Briggs goes to prison instead of sending more men after you for the rest of your life." She sat with that for a long time. He sat with her, not pushing, just present. Out the window, she could see Benjamin trying to convince Cannonball to eat an apple from his hand, using a very serious and extended argument that she suspected the horse was at least partially following. She said finally, "If I do this, if I go to Price, I want Benjamin nowhere near any of it." Dexter said, "Agreed," she said, "and I need to know what you know about Briggs, everything, not just what you've already told me." He said, "All right." Then he told her. It took a long time because there was a lot of it. He told her about the water rights dispute and the night of the fire, told her things he had clearly never told anyone. And she understood that telling her was costing him something, and that he was spending it willingly because he had decided she was worth the cost. By the time he was finished, the lamp had burned low and the room was full of shadows, and Abigail Fletcher felt something she had told herself she would not feel again, something that had no safe name and no careful category. She said, "Dexter, you have been carrying this alone for 3 years." He said, "Yes," she said, "you should have had someone." He looked at her across the low light and did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "I know." She reached across the table and put her hand on his, just for a moment, just briefly. Then she took it back and stood up and said she was going to check on Benjamin, and she left the kitchen and went down the hall and stood in the dark of the back bedroom for a full minute with her hand pressed against her sternum, telling herself to be sensible, telling herself that the forbidden simplicity of what she was feeling was going to get her into the exact kind of trouble she could not afford. She was not sensible, but she was, at least, careful, for the time being. 3 days later, The threat arrived in a form more immediate than men asking questions in Caldwell Creek. Eli came riding in hard in the middle of the afternoon looking white under his usual color, and he said he had seen two men he did not know camped in Packers Canyon, which was the only direct route between the ranch and the main road east. They had not been hunting and they had not been traveling. They had been waiting. Dexter listened to this with perfect calm, and then he sent Eli home by the South Trail and told him to stay there. He came inside and told Abigail to keep Benjamin indoors and away from the windows. She watched him load his Winchester rifle and check his revolver with the efficient, unhurried movements of a man who has faced physical danger before and knows that calm is its own form of armor, and she felt a sharp, blade-like fear that was not for herself. She said, "Don't go out there alone." He said, "I'm not going out there. I'm making sure that if they come here, I'm ready." She said, "What if they do come here?" He said. "Then we deal with it." He looked at her. "I've sent word to Marshal Price through a man I trust in Caldwell Creek. He should receive it within 2 days. The goal is to last 2 days without anything getting out of hand." She said, "You sent word to Price already?" "Before we decided," he said. "I sent word the day Eli told me about the men in town asking questions. I should have told you immediately. I'm sorry for that." She absorbed this. She said, "You sent word without asking me." He said, "Yes, and I'm telling you now. If you want me to send a second message telling Price to disregard the first, I will do it." She looked at him for a long moment. He had made a decision about her situation without consulting her, which was the kind of thing she had learned to be angry about. But he was also telling her the truth about it and offering to undo it, which was not the behavior of a man who thought her choices were irrelevant. It was the behavior of a man who had acted on instinct to protect her, and was honest enough to admit it and respectful enough to put the decision back in her hands. She said, "Don't send the second message." He nodded once. That night the tension on the ranch wound tighter. They ate dinner quietly, and Benjamin, with the uncanny sensitivity of children to the emotional weather of the adults around them, was subdued and close to Abigail's side. After she put him to bed, she came back out to find Dexter sitting at the table with a map spread out, tracing the terrain between the ranch and Grantham with his finger. She sat down across from him. She said, "Tell me what you're thinking." He said, "Briggs will be careful. He doesn't move openly. He uses men who can be explained away. If those two in Packers Canyon are his, they're there to watch, not to act directly. Not yet. He'll want to know first whether you're here and what I have to do with you. He'll send someone to talk before he does anything else. He likes to negotiate. He thinks everything has a price," she said. "And when he finds out I'm not coming to terms," he said, "then it gets harder." She said, "Has he ever gone up against a man who didn't come to terms?" He said, "He burned a barn and killed a woman, and the county sheriff called it an accident. That's the answer to that question." She looked at her hands on the table. She said, "I'm afraid." He said, "Good. Fear is information. It tells you what to protect," she said. "Right now it's telling me to protect you." He looked up. The directness of it landed in the space between them like something thrown. He said quietly, "You don't need to do that." She said, "No, I want to." She met his eyes and held them. "I am very aware that I have arrived at your door with nothing but complications and trouble, and a 4-year-old boy who is trying to negotiate a friendship with your most opinionated horse, and you have given me shelter and honesty and more patience than I have any right to, and I would very much prefer that you remain alive and well at the end of this." Something moved through his expression, something she could not quite name but recognized with a deep, wordless certainty. He said, "Abigail." She said, "Do not say something practical right now." He didn't. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, very carefully, "I have not let myself care about anyone since Clara. I decided after she died that caring about people was a thing I could not afford to do anymore. I thought I had done a good enough job of it." A pause, a long one. "And then you came over that hill carrying your boy on your back, and I don't think I had done as good a job as I thought." She felt the warmth of that move through her like something physical, like the first real warmth after a very long cold. She said, I decided something similar after Thomas died. Mine was that I would never let another person become necessary to me, because necessary people have a habit of becoming losses. He said, and I appear to be considerably less disciplined than I gave myself credit for. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, slowly, giving her every opportunity to move it, and she did not move it. She turned it over and held his hand back. They sat like that in the lamplight with the map of the territory between them and the darkness outside the windows and the sound of the ranch settling into night, and it was one of the most honest moments Abigail Fletcher could remember. No pretense, no performance, no hidden motive. Just two people who had been alone in the same pain for a long time and had found each other on the wrong side of a serious problem, and were not sorry about it. He said, "When this is over," she said, "when this is over." That was all. It was enough. The next day the man from Briggs came. He arrived mid-morning on a good horse, well dressed, the kind of man who has been sent to create an impression of reasonableness. His name was Addison, and he rode up to the ranch house with the cheerful confidence of a debt collector who has never yet failed to collect. Dexter met him in the yard. Abigail stayed inside with Benjamin and watched through the curtain and kept her breathing even. Addison said he represented a business interest and that he understood there was a woman named Abigail Fletcher on the property. He said his employer wished to make her a very generous offer for her silence on matters she had unfortunately come to know through the late unfortunate Mr. Fletcher. He said the offer included enough money to relocate comfortably and a guarantee that she and her son would not be troubled further. Dexter said that he did not have any guests on the property by that name. Addison looked at him with the flat patience of a man who is used to being lied to and does not mind it particularly. He said that his employer would be disappointed to hear that, and that his employer's disappointment tended to manifest in inconvenient ways. Dexter said that his employer was welcome to come and be disappointed in person any time he liked. Then he said that he was now going to go back to his work, and that Addison should ride back the way he came, and that if he or anyone else came onto this property again without an invitation, Dexter would treat it as a trespass. Addison looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled and said his employer had hoped it would not come to this. He turned his horse and rode away. Dexter came inside. He said, "They know you're here." "They were testing whether I would give you up," she said. "What happens now?" he said. "Now we wait for Price and we hope 2 days is fast enough." It was not quite fast enough. Marshal Garland Price arrived on the afternoon of the following day, but the night before his arrival was the longest of Abigail's life on the ranch. She woke at 2 in the morning to Dexter's voice at the bedroom door, low and controlled, saying her name. She was on her feet before she was fully awake. He said, "Someone's in the barn. Stay inside with Benjamin." Then he was gone. She sat in the dark with Benjamin asleep beside her and listened to the ranch. She heard the barn door, heard voices she could not distinguish, heard a single sharp sound that might have been a confrontation of some kind. She gripped the iron bed frame and held herself completely still and did not allow herself to go to the window because she had promised, and because the promise was the only useful thing she could do in that moment. It was 30 minutes before she heard his boots on the porch. She was at the bedroom door before he could knock. He was fine. He had a cut on his jaw from where someone had thrown something in the dark, but he was fine. He said there had been 2 of them and that they had been attempting to set fire to the hay stored in the loft, and that they had not succeeded, and that they were now tied up in the barn waiting for the law. She looked at the cut on his jaw. She crossed the room and came back with the cloth and the camphor oil from the nightstand, and she cleaned the cut without speaking, and he sat still and let her and watched her face while she worked. And when she was done, she did not move away immediately, and he reached up and covered her hand with his, where it rested against his cheek, and they stayed like that in the dark kitchen for a moment that felt suspended outside of ordinary time. She said, "I'm glad you're all right," he said. "So am I then," quietly. "Go back to bed. I'll watch the rest of the night." She went. She lay next to Benjamin and listened to the silence of the ranch and thought about the feeling of his hand over hers and the particular quality of the way he had looked at her. And she knew with the certainty of something that has moved from possibility to fact that she was deeply, irreversibly in love with Dexter Shelby. It was not the quick, bright feeling of early infatuation. It was the other kind, the kind that settles into your bones and reorganizes your understanding of what you want your life to be. Marshall Garland Price was a compact, serious man of about 45 with a gray-streaked beard and the kind of eyes that had seen enough of the world's worst to be very still and very watchful. He arrived with 2 deputies and received the 2 men from the barn without ceremony and listened to Dexter's account and to Abigail's account with complete, professional attention. He said, "Mrs. Fletcher, you said you witnessed your husband maintain records of transactions with Briggs's organization." She said, "I saw enough to be able to describe the nature of those transactions in detail. Names, figures, the nature of the arrangements. I burned the book itself, but I remember what was in it." Price said, "That kind of testimony from someone who can describe the contents of a destroyed document with enough specificity, combined with what we already have, could be very significant." He looked at her carefully. "I want to be honest with you about what this means. You would need to make a formal statement. Your name would be part of the record, and Briggs has resources and connections that make him a dangerous man to testify against." She said, "I know. I'm going to do it anyway." He looked at her for a moment, then at Dexter, then back. He said, "The 2 men in the barn are already talking. They want consideration in exchange for information about the chain of command. If this moves the way I think it might, we could be looking at federal charges against Briggs within the month." Dexter said, "I want the fire included. 3 years ago, October 1875. The barn fire that killed Clara Shelby." Price said, "I know about it. It's in the case file I've been building. Your testimony about the water rights dispute and the timing is important." He paused. "I'm sorry it took this long, Mr. Shelby." Dexter said nothing, but something in his face shifted, the infinitesimal softening of a man who has been holding something rigid for a very long time. The formal statements took the better part of 2 days. Price and his deputies stayed at the ranch while this was completed, which provided a practical layer of protection that made those days feel less exposed than the days before. Abigail sat with Price and laid out everything she remembered, every name she had heard Thomas speak, every figure she had seen in the ledger, every transaction she could describe. It was exhausting and occasionally frightening, and she did it with careful, complete honesty, holding nothing back. In the evenings, she was too tired to manage the careful distance she had been maintaining from Dexter, and she stopped trying. She sat next to him at the table instead of across it. When Benjamin crawled into her lap after dinner, complaining that he was not sleepy in the tone of someone who was approximately 4 minutes from unconsciousness, Dexter sat beside them and told Benjamin a story about a horse named Cannonball who had once decided, entirely on his own initiative, that the best way across a flooded creek was to swim it despite everyone's perfectly reasonable objections. And Benjamin fell asleep in Abigail's lap somewhere around the part where Cannonball reached the opposite bank looking extremely pleased with himself. And Dexter Shelby carried the sleeping boy down the hall and into the back bedroom and laid him down with the quiet, deliberate care of a man handling something precious, and pulled the blanket up without waking him. He stood there in the dark for a moment with his hand on the edge of the blanket, and Abigail stood in the doorway and watched him and felt something that went beyond love into something larger and quieter, the recognition of a man who was exactly what he appeared to be, which in her experience was the rarest thing in the world. He turned and saw her in the doorway. The lamp from the hall was behind her, and he was standing in the dark, and they looked at each other across the small room and across everything they had been through in the last week and across the long separate loneliness of the last years. And she said softly, "Come here." He crossed the room. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, against the fading cut, and he covered her hand again the way he had in the kitchen, and then she rose onto her toes and kissed him. It was brief and gentle, and utterly deliberate. He kissed her back and then pressed his forehead against hers in the dark and breathed and held her hand against his face, and she could feel the fine tremor of something letting go in him, the releasing of something he had been holding shut for 3 years. He said quietly, "Abigail," she said, "I know." He said, "I haven't," and stopped. She said, "I know, me too." They stood like that in the dark for a while and let the night hold them, with Benjamin sleeping a foot away, and the marshal and his deputies in the main room and the ranch quiet outside. And it was the first time either of them had felt genuinely at peace in a very long time. 2 weeks after Marshal Price left with his statements and his prisoners, word came back through a reliable channel that federal warrants had been issued for Colton Briggs and 4 associates. Briggs was taken into custody in Grantham without significant resistance, which Price had later told Dexter was a sign of how thoroughly the man's network had been disrupted by the statements. When the men he trusted most were looking at federal charges and cutting deals, Briggs had found himself suddenly and catastrophically isolated. The county sheriff who had ruled Clara's death an accident was not arrested, as there was not enough to charge him. But he resigned within the month and left the territory, which was its own kind of accounting. Abigail received official word from Price that she was no longer a person of interest to Briggs's organization, that with Briggs facing trial and his network dismantled, the men who had been watching her had dispersed. The specific threat she had been living under for a year and a half was gone. She sat with this information in the kitchen of the Shelby Ranch on a cold morning in November 1878, with Benjamin on the floor playing a complex game involving several smooth stones and the systematic evaluation of which one's cannonball would prefer. And she thought about what came next. Dexter came in from the morning rounds and she handed him his coffee, and he stood at the kitchen window looking out at the frost on the ground and said, "It's over." She said, "Yes." He said, "You're free to go wherever you want to go." She said, "I know that." A pause. He turned and looked at her. She looked back. She said, "Dexter, I have nowhere better to be." He said, "That's not a reason to stay." She said, "No, there is a reason to stay. The reason just happens to also have nowhere better to be." He set his coffee cup down. He said, "Are you going to make me ask you directly?" She said, "I thought you might appreciate the opportunity to do it properly." He looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had come over his hill with a child on her back and a secret in her pocket, and had, in the space of 3 weeks, dismantled every carefully constructed defense he had built around what was left of his heart. He said, "I would like you to stay, not because it's safer here, not because you have nowhere else to go, because I want you here, because I want Benjamin here. Because this house has been empty for 3 years in a way that had nothing to do with furniture and everything to do with the fact that I was in it alone, and I don't want to be alone in it anymore." A pause. "I would like to court you properly if you'll allow it. And if that goes the way I hope, I'd like to ask you to marry me." She said, "That's a very organized declaration." He said, "I'm an organized man." She said, "Yes, I had noticed that." Then she crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him and looked up at his serious, steady, quietly beautiful face and said, "I would very much like to stay. I would like to be courted properly. And I would like to give you a definitive answer on the last part when you actually ask it." He said, "Fair enough." She said, "Although the answer will be yes." He smiled, and it was the full version of the rare, unguarded smile she had seen for the first time when Benjamin had said he understood cannonball, and it transformed his face entirely, and she thought that she was going to spend a very long time learning all the versions of that smile and considering herself extremely well compensated for the effort. Benjamin looked up from his stone evaluation project and said, "Are you two doing that thing where you talk but mean something else?" Dexter said, "Yes." Benjamin considered this and went back to his stones. "Cannonball does that too," he said. "It's confusing." They both laughed, and the kitchen was full of warmth and winter light, and the particular feeling of something beginning that has been earned through difficulty and chosen through honesty. and Abigail Fletcher thought that she had arrived at the right place by the worst possible road, and that this was, in fact, exactly how she would have wanted it if she had been brave enough to want it. The courtship that followed was, as advertised, proper. Dexter was not a demonstrative man in public, but in private, he was a man of careful and consistent attentions that said more than any grand gesture could have. He brought her things he thought she might want before she asked for them. He talked to her as an equal on every subject from the management of the land to the larger machinery of the world. He asked her opinion and took it seriously. He taught Benjamin to ride Cannonball with a patience and gentleness that made Abigail have to find reasons to go to the other end of the yard, because watching it undid her completely every time. He asked her to marry him on a cold, clear evening in December, standing in the yard with the stars overhead and the smell of wood smoke and cattle and frozen grass, with Benjamin asleep inside after a day that had included his first proper trot on Cannonball, and a level of personal triumph that had sent him to bed practically glowing. Dexter said the words plainly and without ornament because he was that kind of man, and she said yes with her whole self, without any of the careful reservation she had lived behind for 2 years, and he held her in the cold dark, and she pressed her face into the shoulder of his coat and felt the solid warmth of him and thought this. This is what the word home means. They were married in the spring of 1879 in Caldwell Creek, in the small church on the main street, in front of a congregation that included Eli and his family and Marshall Price, who had made a special trip from Pueblo, and Mrs. Oakes, who had written to Abigail after everything settled and who was, it turned out, exactly the kind of woman who shows up for occasions that matter. Benjamin stood next to Dexter during the ceremony with an expression of such profound and proprietary satisfaction that several people in the congregation had to cover their smiles. The preacher asked Dexter whether he took Abigail Fletcher to be his wife. Dexter said, "I do," with a quiet certainty that felt less like a recitation and more like a fact he was confirming about something he already knew. The preacher asked Abigail whether she took Dexter Shelby to be her husband. She looked at him and saw everything that was in his face, the steadiness, the tenderness, the patience, the grief he had come through, the solitary years, all of it, and said, "I do," and meant every syllable of it with the whole of herself. Life on the Shelby ranch in the years that followed was not without its difficulties. The land was hard and the work was constant, and the winters in Garfield County did not make exceptions for newlyweds or growing boys. But the particular quality of hardship that comes from bearing everything alone was gone from Dexter's life, and the particular quality of fear that comes from running was gone from Abigail's, and what replaced them was something solid and sustaining that neither of them had been sure they would ever have again. Benjamin adapted to life on the ranch with the wholehearted ease of a child who has found the place he belongs. He grew into a serious, capable boy who had his mother's intelligence and what everyone agreed was his own particular stubbornness, and he spent an enormous portion of his energy on Cannonball, who remained opinionated, but had apparently decided that Benjamin was worth his cooperation, which the horse demonstrated by accepting an extraordinary range of requests that he refused from everyone else. Dexter watched this relationship develop with a quiet pride he made no attempt to disguise. He formally adopted Benjamin in the summer of 1879, with the boys' wholehearted agreement and a legal proceeding in Caldwell Creek that Benjamin attended dressed in his best clothes, with an expression of solemn importance that made Abigail cry, quietly, into her handkerchief, while Dexter held her hand and pretended not to notice she was doing it. Benjamin became Benjamin Shelby, which he tried out approximately 40 times in the following week as if testing the fit of it, and declared satisfactory. In the spring of 1880, Abigail told Dexter she was expecting. He received this information standing in the kitchen, and then he sat down in the kitchen chair and put his face in his hands for a moment, And when he looked up, his eyes were bright with something that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but was some specific combination of both that only arrives when a person who has lost something enormous is given back something equivalent. She sat down in his lap and put her arms around him and held him, and he held her back, and they stayed like that for a long time in the kitchen while the spring afternoon light moved across the floorboards. Their son, James Thomas Shelby, was born in November of 1880. He arrived red-faced and forcefully opinionated, which Dexter said was a family trait, and which Abigail said was unfair given who was doing the work. He had Dexter's dark eyes and Abigail's dark hair and Benjamin's complete attention and interest from the first moment, as Benjamin appointed himself an authority on the subject of being a Shelby and took the role with characteristic gravity. Dexter held his son for the first time in the quiet after the birth, with the doctor packing up his bag in the corner and Abigail watching from the bed, exhausted and radiant in the specific way of women who have just done the most extraordinary thing a person can do. Dexter held the boy and looked at him and then looked at Abigail, and what was in his face was something she had never seen on anyone's face before, a happiness so clean and uncomplicated that it seemed to illuminate everything around it. He said, "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he said. "For coming over that hill." She laughed, which turned into something closer to tears, which he came and sat beside her and held her through until it resolved back into something that was just simple happiness. The trial of Colton Briggs concluded in the late autumn of 1880 in Denver, and Abigail did indeed testify. She traveled to Denver with Dexter in October, while Benjamin stayed on the ranch with Eli's family, whom he regarded as a secondary base of operations he was generally happy to deploy to. She gave her testimony with the clear, detailed precision of a woman who has had 2 years to decide that the truth is the safest and most powerful thing she possesses, and she did not flinch from any of it. Dexter sat in the gallery and watched her, and she knew he was there, and it helped more than she had expected. Colton Briggs was convicted on charges of extortion, conspiracy, and the destruction of property, with the arson conviction relating to the Shelby barn explicitly included in the record. He received a sentence of 15 years in federal prison. The judge, in delivering the sentence, made note of the courage of the witnesses who had come forward. Abigail and Dexter sat together in the street outside the courthouse afterward in the late October sun, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and said, "It's really over." He said, "Yes." He put his arm around her. All of it. She thought about Thomas, who had been a weak man who had made terrible choices but who had also been, in the beginning, a man she had loved in the uncomplicated way of youth before she had known what love could cost. She thought about Clara, who had been Dexter's person and who had died because of the same darkness that had chased Abigail across 2 states, and she thought that both of them deserved to have the story end here with the man responsible answering for it. She hoped, in the quiet way of someone who has moved past anger into something simpler, that it was some kind of accounting. She said, "Do you think about her often, Clara?" He said, "Yes. Less than I used to, in a different way." A pause. "She would have liked you. She had no patience for people who were not honest." She said, "High praise." He said, "Yes, it is." She lifted her head and looked at him and said, "I love you, Dexter Shelby." He said, "I love you, Abigail Shelby." He said her name the way he had said it that first night in the kitchen, plain and complete, the way you say the name of someone who has become the entire weight of what the word home means. Then he kissed her on the courthouse steps in downtown Denver in October 1880 in full view of anyone who happened to be looking, which for a man of his particular reserve was essentially the equivalent of a proclamation, and she laughed against his mouth, and he smiled the full version of the smile, and they went to collect their son. The years that followed on the Shelby ranch were full years, good ones on balance. There were bad winters and dry summers and the ordinary difficulties of a life built close to the land. There were neighbors and disputes and the slow, permanent work of a going enterprise. There was the ongoing conversation of Benjamin and Cannonball, which was long-running and appeared to satisfy both parties. There was James growing into a small, fierce, endlessly curious person who had to be specifically deterred from a range of activities that seemed perfectly reasonable to him and alarming to everyone else. In 1882, Abigail gave birth again. This time it was a girl, and they named her Clara Shelby, and Dexter held her in the kitchen of the house he had been alone in for so long and rocked her and said nothing for a long time. And Abigail watched him from the doorway and felt the fullness of what their life had become and thought about the particular mercy of time, the way it does not erase pain, but builds something around it, the way love that is truly earned is made stronger by the difficulty of what came before. Benjamin was 7 by then, and received his sister with the critical attention of someone assessing a new variable in a complex system, then announced that she was satisfactory. James, who was almost 2 and did not have a theoretical framework for younger siblings yet, simply sat down next to where Clara lay in the cradle and put his hand carefully on her head, and it was one of the most purely sweet things Abigail had ever seen. Dexter watched his children on a spring morning in 1883, Benjamin at the fence with Cannonball, James toddling with great determination toward whatever had caught his attention in the yard, Clara in Abigail's arms on the porch, and he stood in the yard between all of it and felt the particular weight of a life that has been built from the ruins of the worst thing that ever happened to you, a weight that is both heavy and sustaining, the weight of something real. Abigail came and stood beside him, Clara drowsing on her shoulder, and slipped her free hand into his. He closed his fingers around hers without looking away from the yard, and she leaned against his arm, and they stood there together in the bright spring morning and watched their lives move around them. She said, "You're not solitary anymore." He said, "No, I'm not." Then, after a moment, quietly, "I hadn't realized how much I missed it, people I mean, the weight of other people's days leaning against yours." She said, "I know. I spent a long time trying not to need that." He said, "How's that going?" She laughed. She said, "Terribly, complete failure. I appear to need it very badly." He said, "Good. So do I." He kissed the top of her head. "So does she, probably." He meant Clara, who was making small sounds against Abigail's shoulder. And him. He meant James, who had just sat down heavily in the dirt and was looking at his own hands with the expression of someone who has arrived at an important philosophical position. And him. He meant Benjamin, who had persuaded Cannonball to extend his head over the top rail and was saying something to the horse with great seriousness. She said, "We have made quite a population here." He said, "We have." She turned and looked up at him and said, "Are you happy, Dexter?" He looked at the yard, at the children, at the house that was no longer empty in any of the ways it had been empty at her, and he said, "Yes." "More than I know how to say." She said, "You don't have to say it." He said, "I know, but I want to." He turned and looked at her, her dark eyes and her honest face, and the 3 years of running and the one terrible winter and the morning she had come over his hill and changed the entire direction of his life. And he said, with the plain and complete directness of a man who means everything he says and says nothing he doesn't mean, "I am the luckiest man in Garfield County, Colorado Territory. Possibly in the state." A pause. "Probably in the country," she said. "That's a large claim." He said, "I'm prepared to defend it." She said, "On what grounds?" He said, "On the grounds that I have you, and them, and this." He meant the land and the house and the horses and the cold mornings and the hard work and all of it, everything that made up the texture of their days, everything that had been lonely and was no longer lonely, everything that had been broken and had healed into something stronger than the original. On the grounds that this is exactly the life I wanted and did not know how to want until you showed me what it was supposed to look like. She pressed her face against his arm and held his hand and held their daughter and felt the specific, solid, irreplaceable weight of being known and chosen and loved by someone who sees everything you are, including the frightened parts and the complicated parts and the parts that have been through too much, and loves you not in spite of those parts, but because of what they made you. James got up from the dirt, and toddled toward them with the focused determination of someone who has decided his parents' legs are the appropriate destination. He arrived and held onto Dexter's knee and looked up with his father's dark eyes and said something that was approximately the word up. And Dexter released Abigail's hand and bent, and lifted the boy with the easy, practiced motion of a man who has been doing this long enough that it is simply part of the grammar of his days, and settled James on his hip, and the boy immediately grabbed his collar and looked around at the yard from this improved vantage point with great satisfaction. Abigail watched this and thought about the night she had stood in the doorway of the back bedroom and watched this man carry her sleeping son and pull a blanket over him in the dark. She thought about how she had felt in that moment, the frightened recognition of something she had told herself she could not afford, the door opening inside her that she had tried to close again and had not been able to, and she thought that the thing she had been afraid of had turned out to be the best thing that had ever happened to her. Not the falling in love, though that was extraordinary, the particular thing. The sight of a solitary man, a man who had been alone and hard-edged and carefully closed, standing in the dark over a sleeping child that was not his and pulling the blanket up with the tenderness of someone who cannot help themselves, and the knowledge that settled into her then without her permission, the irreversible knowledge that this was a good man, the kind of good that goes all the way down, and that she was in very serious trouble, and that the trouble was the best kind. She had been right on all three counts. She shifted Clara to her other shoulder and stepped closer to Dexter and the boy on his hip, and Benjamin called from the fence that Cannonball wanted everyone to come and see something, and James pointed in Benjamin's direction as if he had been thinking the same thing, and Dexter looked at Abigail and raised one eyebrow, which was his version of a question, and she nodded, and they walked across the yard together toward the fence in the morning light, toward the opinionated horse and the serious boy and the wide country all around them, and it was exactly right, and it was exactly enough, and it was, with the full weight of everything it had taken to get here, the life she had been made for.